In this tutorial, I'm going to demonstrate how to make the crawling cell rig that's documented on the wiki. Here's, well, the almost finished product, just a basic piece of geometry that you can grab certain points and drag them out, and the object will deform. So it's a way to make sort of pseudopodia that can reach out. It's kind of useful for doing animations of cells that are crawling through a 3D type matrix. It doesn't really reflect the way that cells crawl on a 2D surface where they uh, sort of cycle their innards forward and it comes out on the outside and they have this kind of lamellar flow. But in terms of making sort of almost a cartoony version or a version that can reach out and grab different parts of a 3D matrix, this can work pretty well. So I'll just go through this from the beginning, and like I say, it's documented on the wiki, but the video tutorial may help. So I'm just going to create a new file, and I'm going to build this just based on a very simple piece of geometry, smoothed cube. Just going to scale it up. So I'll just smooth it a couple of times, and I'm going to squash it down a little bit. So this makes a very basic piece of geometry, but it depends what you need it for. You can add other pieces to it, make it more complex, but this is the basic setup, and if you understand this, you can tweak it to whatever you need. So I'm just going to delete the history on this object. I've just got a shortcut up here, but you all know where the history button is. So this is going to be our cell body. And we're going to use some joints, just as things that we can grab and move around easily, because when you have a joint in a piece of geometry, if you marquee select over them, the joint will always be selected preferentially. You can see that up here in the status bar. This shows all the things, my selection masks, so they're all clicked on, so it means I can select any type of object in the scene. I can turn this off and I can't select geometry now. This is the joint selection, so it means I can select joints, but the order in which they're displayed in is important here. Handles are selected preferentially over joints, which are selected preferentially over curves, over surfaces, deformers, and so on. So by using a joint, it's pretty top of the list and it gets selected easily, because it's going to be inside our objects. We want to be able to select it without always accidentally selecting the outside surface. So we're just going to create 5 joints for this. So go to skeleton, joint tool. Just going to put one right in the middle of the world here. Then I'm going to put one on each of these sort of 4 quadrants. Oops. I just made a mistake. You want to make a joint and then hit the Y tool, because it ends that chain and just activates the joint again, so you don't get a bone between the joints. Remember, we're just using these as little placeholders, so I'm hitting Y to finish the chain and start the tool again, so I get 5 joints that way. Now I'm going to open my outliner because I want to name this so I don't get confused as I go along here. So joint 1, I'm going to call central joint. Call this one northwest. This one northeast, this one southeast, or southwest. Call them whatever you like. So now I'm just going to select this joint, shift select the body here. I'm just going to rename it cell body. So go back and do that again. Select the central joint, shift select the cell body, and go to skin, bind skin, smooth bind. Make sure it's reset to its defaults. So we haven't really talked about doing making joints yet, but it's just this whole geometry is bound to this joint now. Since it's just a single joint with no bones, not linked to anything else, just by moving the joint, you move the entire geometry. Okay, so now I'm going to create a NURBS circle. Oops, here. This is just going to be an object that's easy to select in the scene. Just give it 8 sections, create it. I'm going to scale it up, Now you don't really need to do this part, but I just like to give it a distinctive shape so I can easily grab it. Just grab some of the CVs, shrink them down. So now I'm going to parent all of my joints to this. So I'll just call this translation node. And this is the object we can use just to move our cell to any point in the scene. Um, just for convenience sake, sometimes called the God node too. So select all these and just middle mouse drag them on here. So if I open up, you can see that my joints have been parented to my translation node here. So if I select this now, it moves everything because the geometry is also parented, or it's skinned to this central joint. Alright, so now what we're going to use to deform this object to make it and create these pseudopodia is something called the sculpt deformer. So if you just select the geometry, and while you have the geometry selected, go to Create Deformers, Sculpt Deformer, and just make sure it's at the default settings. Create. I'm going to do this 4 times and then point constrain the sculpt deformer, the sculptor here, to each of these joints. And then I'm going to, you see the sculptor also has a locator that's called the sculpt stretch origin. And all this does is that it tells Maya which direction the sculpt should be happening in. So if I grab my sculptor here and I move it around, you can see it's deforming my object, but it's deforming it relative to the center of the object here, and that's because that's where my sculpt stretch origin locator is. If I move that around, you can see that the nature of the deformation changes. Just going to undo back out of that. So I'm going to grab this sculptor and I'm going to point constrain it to this joint. So select the joint, shift select the sculptor, constrain, constrain, point. I'm just going to make sure all my settings are back to default, and it pops right there. I also want to point constrain my sculpt stretch origin locator to the central joint. I can also just parent it just by dragging it onto it. Just rather than using a constraint, I'll just actually parent it that way. Okay. Just scaling down that sculptor a little bit so it doesn't have effects so far reaching. So now if I select this joint, it drags the sculptor with it. Okay. Now I'll do that again, one for each of these. So probably edit this part out. Maybe I'll just do it one more time so you can see it. So with the object selected, create deformers, sculpt deformer, select this joint, shift select the sculpt deformer. In my recent commands, I can just go to perform point constraint, grab this new sculpt to stretch origin, parent it to the central joint, and continue. See, this one's actually a little bigger. Scale this down a bit. Select this sculpt deformer, joint, sculpt deformer, perform point constraint, scale it down a bit. I'm working at a different scale this time, so again, just select the geometry, sculpt deformer, joint, sculpt deformer, recent commands, perform point constraint, scale this down a little bit. Okay, I just have to now parent this last sculpt stretch origin locator to the central joint. Now I can still want to check to make sure that when I select this outside node, I can still move everything around without affecting the deformations on the geometry. Now you can see that when I do a marquee select around all of these objects, only the joint is selected because it has preferential treatment. So now I can drag it out and you can see that it's deforming the object. Now obviously this is a pretty low-res object, but I could now add a smooth node to it. and get a more gradual deformation. Now, so this works. If I look here, if I want to animate this, I can do that. I can drag it out, set keys on the position of this joint, do it again, can do this, move this one out, so on. But I'm going to set it up one step further, actually a couple of steps, but I'll do the next step in another tutorial, just so this one's not too long. But I'm going to make this sort of a walkable cell. So when I pull its pseudopod forward, it pulls the rest of the cell with it. And so I can sort of walk it around the scene. And it's pretty easy to do this. I just want to select each of these joints and then finally select the central joint. And then I'm going to put a point constraint on. So what this is doing is constraining this central joint to which this entire piece of geometry is skinned. I'm constraining this central joint to each of these sort of peripheral joints. And that means it's going to try and maintain equidistance between all of them. And by doing that, it's going to drag the whole geometry forward, or in whatever direction I make the cell crawl. So if I pull that, you can see it's trying to reach, keep a good relationship with all of these things. So if I drag this one, and then if I start dragging these ones down, I can animate it walking forward. You can have it reaching out. Of course, it works in different dimensions, so you can get the cell in these kind of funny shapes. Just walk it back. And there you go. You've got a crawling, very basic, but a crawling cell. So I'm going to come back in another tutorial and demonstrate how to automate a process where when you drag out a pseudopod, it thins out the geometry. Okay? Thanks.